Hi, and welcome back to the ethics introduction videos. We're going to have a second look at deontology because this is for lots of pupils the hardest ethical perspective, and for just reason that's the case, because you can see, especially in this crisis situation as is the pandemic with the COVID-19, it's not that easy and it's quite challenging to see how deontology works because it has such a high bar and the standard is so high. You need to look for rules that everybody agrees upon and not only the majority. It's often democratic practice just to look for a democratic majority to see what interests are best served, but that's actually utilitarian. That's the greatest happiness, the greatest number of people for a meal. And that has one big downside, that the individuals and minorities are the weakest parties and might be, and that might risk their interest, their health, and their well-being. So deontology as a high bar, it's the ethical perspective behind human rights. But we're going to have a look at the logic behind it. Back to the mock test. We have seen in a previous video that deontology involves sacrifice. And the sacrifice in this case of the gig worker staying at home with just some COVID-19 symptoms. And that's a huge price he needs to pay for himself for the benefit of the public health. Some say that the economical effects for some are simply too big in deontology. But that's exactly what it is. In deontology, you don't look to effects or results or consequences. You reason for a big part out of values like human dignity and free will. You don't look to the consequence, but you look to values as a starting and a final point. So all decisions must be thinkable as a universal law agreed upon by all and not just the majority out of free will, regardless of the consequences for some. As a result, and as a criticism, some say, hey, this deontology stuff is protecting free will, right? Free will is so important. How can it be that lots of people need to limit themselves for others to make sure that, for instance, in this case, public health is served? They say that deontology at its core has free will above all, but that's not true, because free will is not an end in itself, or freedom is not an end in itself, but the individual is, each human being is a goal in itself, and not the abstract value of free will or freedom. So free will should at least be a par with human dignity, and people cannot be used or sacrificed as a means to go on for the rest of society in freedom. So please keep those two criteria as set out in a previous video together. You cannot simply say, oh, my free will is limited, so that cannot be the case in deontology. Let's have a simple thought experiment just to see that this is a very logical theory. You do know that as a tool, you could think of the categorical imperative from the perspective of the veil of ignorance. You should be able to place yourself in the shoes of everyone involved, and that's everyone, not only the majority. I cannot stress that enough. So in this case, this pandemic case, you could be an ICU patient, intensive care unit patient. You could be a ICU doctor or normal doctor, normal patient. You could be rich, you could be poor, you could be 18, you could be 80. You could be in good health and you could have a poor health for all kinds of reasons. And regardless of these perspectives, you need to think of the fact that everybody endorses your action or the intended action as a rule that can be endorsed by everyone out of free will, by every single one, not just the majority. As a result, all must leave their vested interest and think of the common good. And that's public health in this case. So regardless your private interest, your the income you have, the financial gain or loss, you should really think of the common good. That's typically deontology. That common good might lead to restrict your personal freedom, not as something that's done by force, but out of free will, because you can convince yourself of that restriction as being good. So that goes for the delivery driver staying at home, but in practice that's being done in lots of cases in daily life. For instance, lots of people restrict their personal freedom to drive the speed whatever they like on the highway out of free will, because they know if everybody just do whatever they like, lethal crashes like these can happen. So speed limits are an example of restrictions of freedom that people accept out of free will because they know that the common good presides over their private vested interest. Maybe they like driving really fast, or they might be in a hurry, but they do know that they need to leave their vested interest for the common good, public health or road safety, and only then everyone is served, including themselves, because in lots of other situations you do know you might be the victim of your own behavior, or your loved ones might become the victim of it. So, deontology out of free will, people should or could decide frequently to limit or sacrifice themselves out of the common good. And the only thing is that if so, we should check the fact that no social pressure is infringing the free will. That would be it for now. There's only one video that follows, and that's about writing a good ethical conclusion and argument.